Calvary, where Jesus suffered and died. It's impossible to know what he went through on the cross. Jesus makes 7 statements that hold power for us today. So when life gives its worst, we can still believe, seek, forgive, serve, comfort, surrender. His death becomes our deliverance. His words transform our world. Through the lens of Christ on the cross, we can discover how to live through a bad day.
Hey, is anybody excited to be in church this morning? Come on, would you put your hands together and make some noise? Yeah. Welcome to a kickoff of a brand new series that we're calling How to Live Through a Bad Day, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But as always, I like to just stop right at the top of my message and jump in and welcome everybody that is joining us online. You might be on the other side of a computer or a tablet or maybe your phone, and we're so glad that you are. We know that every week we see that people are joining us from states away and faithfully join us, and we're so glad that no matter where you are along for the ride, that you're with us. And we always say this, if you can be here, if you're somewhere in the area, because we hear a lot of times that people just watched for a couple of weeks before they actually jumped in here. We always say this, if you could be in the building, because something powerful happens when the family of God just gathers together and worships together. So I'm excited today because we're kicking off a brand new series that we're calling How to Live Through a Bad Day. Come on, be honest. Have you ever had a bad day, lived through a bad day? Yeah. Is your bad day next to you? No, don't answer that. I was just kidding. Maybe you've experienced a bad day. You know, you've lived through I've had some of those days where I'm just like, could I just do this one over? Can I just climb back in the bed and just start all over again? Here's the thing I know about bad days. They're going to happen. And you're like, wow, Pastor, that's so encouraging this morning. I'm so glad I came to church. Well, it's true. I mean, we're going to have bad days. They happen to everybody. And the reason why I know this is Jesus said that. He said, in this life, you will have trouble. And that'd be a really depressing statement if he didn't follow it up with what he said, which is, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Which is really good news because that means that Jesus says, I know how to get through this. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this series is some practical steps, some actual ways that we can learn how to not just, survive, but live through a bad day in a way that honors God, in a way that just doesn't cause us to crumble. And so for the next 7 weeks, that's what we're going to be doing, is we're going to take some powerful statements that Jesus made on the cross. These are statements that Jesus said on the cross, and we're going to follow these and see what Jesus has to say about living through a bad day. Now, this series is going to take us all the way up through Resurrection Sunday. And by the way, this is going to be our biggest Easter yet. We're excited. We're going to party hardy, Marty. And we get really excited about this. Yeah, we celebrate what Jesus did on the cross, because here's the thing. Jesus didn't just stay on the cross. He got off the cross. When he got off the cross, they put him in a tomb, but he didn't stay in that either. It's like the guy just has this thing. I just can't stick around for long. I got to get up. And we get excited about that because if he got up, that means that we can get up too. And so we're going to celebrate on Easter Sunday. Go ahead and be thinking about it because we're going to really have a great time. But here's what we want to talk about today is this understanding that we are going to have some bad days. And we're going to look through the lens of how Jesus handled that. Because Jesus made some powerful statements on the cross. Some people think that the moment that Jesus got arrested, he stopped preaching. But I actually think some of the most powerful sermons he ever preached, he preached hanging from a cross. And so we kind of have a theme verse that we're going to look at all throughout this series. And this is what it is. We have it for you in your notes, and it's on the screen as well. It's Hebrews chapter 12. It says this: let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Keep your eyes on Jesus. I love this statement. In the middle of your bad times, in the middle of your hard days, in the middle of those moments where it feels like, gosh, how am I going to get through this? Here's the best advice I could give you is keep your eyes firmly fixed on Jesus. Because Jesus knew exactly where he was headed, and he never lost sight of that. He had a mission, he had a focus, and he never lost that. And all throughout that thing, in the middle of his bad day, he was able to get through it. And here's the thing that he was thinking about. He was not thinking about how bad is this, right? Because that's where I go. In the middle of your bad days, don't you think about like, man, this is so bad. No, Jesus kept his eyes fixed on us. He was looking in the future to us. And that's why he was able, one of the reasons why he made it through this bad day. And if you're familiar with the story of Jesus, then you're aware of how it went. Jesus was arrested. And he was put through a trial, and he was ultimately executed. And we call all those things that happened on that day Good Friday. Now, there wasn't anything good about that for Jesus, but in fact, the only people that it was good for was us. It was a great day for us, but it was the most brutal day in history for Jesus. I mean, it was extremely torturous and extremely bad. It was a terrible day, and it's recorded. That process was recorded in all 4 books of the gospel, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And all throughout this series, what we're going to do is we're going to dive in there, and we're going to follow along Jesus' words and see what he has to say about how he lived through his worst day. And you, if you're familiar with the story, you know that Jesus had his last meal. He got together with his 12 disciples, and following that meal, he went down to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane. It was about 9 p.m. at night. Now, one of his disciples, one of his best friends, by the way, had sold him out and had betrayed him into the hands of the Jewish religious leaders and the Roman leaders. And so they gave him a trial in the middle of the night, which, by the way, was totally illegal. Like you don't do a trial in the middle of the night, but that's what they were doing because they were trying to push their agenda through. Their bottom line is they wanted to get rid of Jesus. Jesus had ruffled the feathers of religious leaders, and they wanted to execute him. And so that's what they did. They put him through a sham trial, and then after the trial, he was beaten, and he was tortured, and for no good reason, he was punished, and then ultimately he was crucified. And they nailed him to a cross, and they hoisted him up to totally humiliate him. And while he is hanging on this cross, Jesus preaches this profound message to us, and it's in the form of a prayer. This is what Jesus says on the cross. He says in Luke chapter 23, he says, "Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing." Now, when you think about everything that Jesus had just been through, everything that he had just endured, the fact that he would say that is absolutely amazing. The fact that he would say, "Father, forgive them for what they're doing," after going through everything that he has gone through. And listen, here's the advice that Jesus is giving you in the middle of your bad day is go ahead and release everybody that has hurt you, everybody that's trying to damage you, everybody that's trying to, here's how the way I say it, and you can follow along in your notes with me. Number 1, forgive everyone who's trying to ruin your life. That's what Jesus is saying. Here's the best advice he could give you. Is on your worst day, forgive everyone who's trying to ruin your life. Now, is it me, or does it seem like there are some people in this life that's like their spiritual gift to ruin lives? You know, like we have Next Steps. You heard Chloe talk about that right after services. Next Steps. You should do that. Find out about the church, and in step 1, we'll kind of give you an introduction of where the church is and why God put us here. But in step 2, next week, what we determine is that you have spiritual gifts that God has placed inside of you. Some of you are blessed and given the gift of prayer and other encouragement, and some of you guys have the gift of hospitality. Sometimes I think it's like some people went through our next step process to determine that their whole purpose in life is to ruin mine. You know, you got people like that in your life. Haven't you ever felt like there's some people that it's like, oh my gosh, are you just determined to make my life miserable? And I think I'm convinced that one of the hardest things in this life for human beings to do is to forgive people that are trying to ruin their life. It's got to be at the top of the list. It's really challenging. It's very hard. I think it's one of the hardest things that we ever do because it's so much easier not to. It's so much easier to say, I'm not going to forgive this person. I'm not going to give them forgiveness. In fact, I'm going to hold back that forgiveness. But can I just tell you that living in unforgiveness, it feels like it's hurting them, but it's actually destroying you. That's what unforgiveness is. I've heard it said a number of different ways. I've heard it said like this: living in unforgiveness is like drinking poison, hoping the other person dies. Right? It's like lighting yourself on fire, hoping the other person dies of smoke inhalation. Right? That's just ridiculous, but this is what the enemy does. He uses unforgiveness as a way to enslave us and to keep us in bondage against the freedom that God wants to have for us. I remember hearing about a pastor one time, and he was preaching this message on this topic of forgiveness. And there were some people that were in the congregation that day, and he was preaching about how Jesus actually says we are to forgive those who harm us. And as he was preaching this message to the people, he said, will you do this? Will you do what Jesus has called you to do? Will you forgive those who have harmed you? Raise your hand if you would. And everybody in the church raised their hand, except for one little old lady on the front row. And he thought, well, she's old. She probably hadn't heard what I had to say. And so he said it again. Raise your hand if you would forgive those who have harmed you, those who have hurt you. And everybody raised their hand except this little old lady. And so he just couldn't help himself. He looked down on the front row and he said, you can't do it, ma'am? You can't forgive your enemies? And she looked up at the preacher and she said, I don't have any enemies. And he said, well, isn't that amazing? That's incredible. He goes, ma'am, can I ask you how old you are? And she said, I'm 96 years old. He said, ladies and gentlemen, a 96-year-old woman has no enemies in your life. Ma'am, would you mind coming up front and telling us how it is that you were able to do that? And so she got to her feet and she came up to the front of the congregation. She looked out and she said, I outlived every one of them snakes. That's one way you could handle it. I mean, that's a tactic you could do, is just try and outlive them. But I don't think it's a good one. I mean, I really don't. That's not what Jesus is telling us. His message is a little bit different. He says, if you really want to experience life the way I want you to experience it, you got to learn how to let go of those grudges. You got to let them go because they're just going to hurt you. And you can decide to hold a grudge and be bitter and take offense. But really, honestly, it's not helping you. It's hurting you. Now, if anybody had the right to hold on to an offense, it was Jesus. If anybody had the right to not forgive or not or somebody had the right to be bitter, it was Jesus. Because on that day, man, he was so abused. He was so betrayed. He was betrayed by some of the people that were supposed to be his best friends, and they accused him of stuff that he would never do, and they put out these accusations, not only that he didn't do, but he would never do. I think one of the hardest things to me that I think about is how challenging it must have been that nobody stepped up. Like, not even those guys he's been rolling with for 3 years. None of them stepped up and said, hey, that's not right. That's not the Jesus I know. None of them did that. And he experienced a rejection. He experienced accusations. He faced abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. The abuse that he took in his body was absolutely insane. The Romans had figured out torture, man. They had this implement called the cat of nine tails. And it was a whip that had 9 smaller whips on the end of it. And inside each whip was fragments of bone and glass and rocks. And they figured out how to do this. And when Jesus was whipped, they would whip, and these little individual whips would hold onto his flesh. And when he pulled it back, it would pull back flesh with it. In fact, scientists trying to reproduce this have determined they used a cow cadaver that's leather. And when they got through doing that, experiencing what Jesus experienced, that cow's flesh was so badly damaged that vital organs were hanging out. I mean, Jesus went through some abuse, some torturous thing. They put a crown of thorns on his head and pressed it on his head. They humiliated him. A lot of times we think, that we have the depiction like Jesus hanging up on the cross, and we'll put like a loincloth over him for modesty's sake. But that's not what it was. He was actually stripped naked in front of his mother, his brothers and sisters, his community, and his friends. Like, he was humiliated. He was up on this cross and experienced all of these things. He dealt with some really, really hard things. And every time I think about that, and you read the stories in the Gospels, you can't help but to think, man, why? And that's the immediate place where I go. When I'm going through a tough time, I'm like, why am I got to deal with this? Why am I going through this challenging moment? And I think about that in Jesus' life. Like, why did he have to go through that? Well, the Bible tells us there was a reason. In fact, in the book of Hebrews, it says this is the reason. It's for this reason that he was made like them, fully human in every way, that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. In other words, what the Bible is saying there is that he had to become just like you and me so that he could pay for the stuff that we deserve to pay for. He had to be just like us. He had to experience this painful moment so that he could become the high priest that we needed. And watch this. This is amazing. Right here in verse 18 it says, because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he's able to help those who are being tempted. That's really, really good news. Write this down, number 2 in your notes. That means that whatever you're going through, Jesus understands what you're feeling. Jesus understands exactly how you feel. And that's incredible. Because that means that everything that you and I go through, there's nothing that you go through, that you and I go through, that you will go through. There's nothing that you experience that Jesus says, well, I don't know how that feels. No, Jesus knows exactly how you feel. He knows what it's like when it feels so bad and you feel rejected and abused and lost. He knows exactly what you're going through. And when you go through those moments, Jesus says, I can not just empathize with you. We've got a God that can sympathize with you as well. And yet Jesus, in spite of that, he says the best advice I could give you is to forgive those who are trying to ruin your life. That's what Jesus tells us to do. Now, I think part of the problem that we have with forgiveness is that we build it out into something that it really isn't. Like we think forgiveness is something that the Bible never describes it as. And what I wanted to do just this morning is before we go forward, I want to just dispel some myths that are just not true. Some things that maybe you think forgiveness is, and maybe that's a reason why you're not able to forgive somebody right now. And these things, I want to just dispel some of these lies. Let me tell you the first thing that forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not minimizing the seriousness of the offense. I think a lot of times we think that. Like if I forgive them, it's just saying what was done to me is just, well, I guess that's okay. And if I just forgive them, what that says is like I just got to get over it. I got to pull myself up by the bootstraps because it's just not a big deal, right? And that's not forgiveness at all. Forgiveness is not minimizing something that was done to you. It's not saying that it didn't hurt. Of course it hurt. And it's not saying that you should just get over it and that you should just move on. That is not what forgiveness is. Of course it hurt. It probably hurt a lot. And some of you have been handled in such a way that you are holding on to something because yes, and frankly, it hurt and it hurt bad. And you've been carrying that for a long time. Forgiveness is not saying just move on, and forgiveness is not minimizing the seriousness of the offense. And here's another thing that forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not reconciliation. I think a lot of times we get that wrong. We think, well, if I forgive them, then what I've got to do is I've got to go to this person and we've got to get this relationship right together, back together. That is not what the Bible is talking about. Reconciliation and forgiveness are two different things. Why? Because reconciliation is a two-player game. Forgiveness has to do with me. Forgiveness is my choice. Forgiveness is the decision that I get to make. And if you think about it, if reconciliation was necessary as like a prerequisite to forgiveness, like if you think about that, then that other person could hold you in bondage to them for a long time. Because what if they don't want to reconcile? Does that mean like, well, I just can never live through unforgiveness? I'll have to live through unforgiveness because that person doesn't want to get back together with me. What if that person is terrible and is an abuser? Like what do you do with that? What if the person has passed away? Like I cannot possibly reconcile the relationship. See, the thing forgiveness is not, these are two entirely different things. Forgiveness and reconciliation are two different things. Forgiveness is the key because what forgiveness does is it keeps me from being permanently a victim. That's what forgiveness does. When you forgive those who have hurt you, when you've forgiven those who disappoint you, you stop being the victim. Because now you have the power. You get the decision whether or not I'm going to do this. Here's the last thing that forgiveness is not, that I think we get mixed up a lot of times. Forgiveness is not letting them off the hook. I think a lot of times we think that, listen, if I forgive them, it's like saying, well, okay, we'll just forget about it. And they have done something terrible. Let me just say it this way. Some of you have been hurt and abused and painful things were done to you, period, full stop. And that's the truth. And forgiveness is not simply saying, well, I'm just going to let them off the hook now. See, I like to think about it this way. Forgiveness is not letting them off your hook. It's putting them on God's hook. It's saying that, listen, I'm no longer going to handle them like I'm the debt collector. Like they owe me something, and I'm constantly replaying it over and over and over in my mind. I can't get out of it. And if I forgive them, then it's just letting this terrible thing that they have done to me off the hook. And that's not the case. You get them off of your hook and you put them on God's hook. And can I just tell you, God's way better at justice than you are at even holding grudges. God's incredible at justice. God is a just God. And it's saying, God, I recognize they did something wrong. I recognize I've been hurt, and I'm just going to put them on your hook because you're better at making sure that justice happens than me. Do you know there was one point in the Old Testament where some people hurt the people of God, and so you know what God did? He struck the whole village with hemorrhoids. I'm not making that up. It's in 1 Samuel. You ought to look it up. Your Bible's fascinating, right? God is so much more creative than me. I would never have thought that. But God's like, okay, don't worry. I'll take care of you. And he struck a whole village with hemorrhoids. See, God is better at justice than we are at unforgiving. And so here's the real question. How do we do this? Like, how do we actually do this? How can we live our lives where we can practically forgive people who have hurt us? Because I think that's where the rubber meets the road. Because I think even with Christians, we can understand this concept, maybe philosophically or theologically, we can get to this place where we're like, okay, I get that. Jesus says I'm supposed to forgive. And so we can sit here and nod our heads and say, yeah, that's good. But when the rubber meets the road, when you actually are called to forgive, how do we do that? How do we practically live out our life where we forgive those that are trying to ruin ours? Well, what I want to do is give you just two very practical steps. These are practical steps that Jesus teaches us to do, and I want to give you a warning before I do. You're not going to want to do any of them, okay? Like there's nothing in you that's going to want to do these things. Like everything inside of you is going to say, no, Jesus, I don't want to do this. And in fact, I don't even think you can do it without Jesus, because your flesh is going to say, this is nothing I want to do. But this is what Jesus tells us to do. Here's what he says in Matthew chapter 5. He says, you have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Okay, when I read that, I'm like, yeah, I can get behind that. I can pray for people who are hurting me. God, you remember that part where you gave them hemorrhoids? Give them a double portion in the name of Jesus. You know, like that. I can do that. You know what I mean? Some of you are like, there's a psalm, Psalm 37, that says, slap the face of my enemies and shatter the teeth of the wicked. Some of you are like, that's my life verse for some people in my life. Like, God, would you just do that for them? No, this is not what Jesus is saying. He's saying when you pray for them, you're actually getting behind and you're saying, God, I am praying for that person. Now, when Jesus originally gave out this message, it was a total fly in the face moment to the people he's preaching to. Because a lot of the stuff that Jesus preached, there was so much that is challenging and difficult to understand. But when Jesus said this, it would have flown in the face of everything they had been taught. I think it's the same is true for us. Like they're like, no, you don't get it, Jesus. It's eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Right? You poke out my eye, I get to poke out your eye. It's slap for slap, you know? And this is the way this thing is supposed to work. And why would I ever possibly pray for somebody? Like, if they slap me, I'm gonna not just slap them, I'm gonna drop an elbow on them. I mean, like the flying elbow, you know? Like, this is what we have been taught. If somebody hurts you, you hurt them back. And in fact, Jesus doesn't just say that. He doesn't just contradict this idea. He ratchets it up to another place. Look what he says in the book of Luke. He said, bless those who curse you. Pray for those who hurt you. Pray for them. Ask God to bless the person that has harmed you. Excuse me? Like, what? Are you insane, Jesus? Like this? How do you do that? Like, how do you do? Like, this is the way I've been going. Like, if you cut me off in traffic and you flip me off, I got two for you. I'll bless you in that way. How about that? I'll peel both bananas. I'll drive with the knee if I have to. You know what I mean? That's how some of you are. That's why we don't give you 5-stone stickers. You know, it's okay. We're all in a process, you know. But this is where we get to, like, when we think about this, we think of revenge, we think of retaliation, we think of payback. That's what we think. And this is what Jesus' message is. No, pray that your enemy be blessed. That's challenging. How do we do that? How do I pray for the person that's abused me? How do you pray for the person that's molested you? How do you pray and ask God to bless those people that are so hurtful and mean, that have been saying things about you? Why would Jesus even teach this to us, to those people that have hurt us? Here's the reason why. I think Jesus knows this powerful statement. Proper attitude, right attitude always comes before right action. The right attitude will always precede the right action. In other words, I've got to get my heart right if I'm ever going to possibly do the right thing. I've got to fall more in love with Jesus if I'm ever going to have the strength to let him go. I've got to ask God for his help if I'm ever going to do this, because I'm probably not going to feel like loving them, right? You're probably not going to feel like forgiving them. But aren't you glad that Jesus didn't follow only his feelings? Because I'm sure Jesus didn't feel like forgiving you. And if somebody like is in your life and they're constantly hurting you and they've been a source of pain in your life, like you probably don't feel like saying, God, would you bless them today? And I don't know about you, but I don't want to live my life as a person that's just blindly following his feelings. And this is so powerful because, and this is the thing I want you to know, write this down. Number 3, forgiveness is not a feeling. Forgiveness is a choice we make. So you get to choose. I get to determine what we're going to do. I get to determine whether I'm going to forgive that person that has hurt me. Now, I want you to notice that nothing that I have said, absolutely zero of what I've said, involves any interaction with another person. Like literally, I'm not saying that you have to get up here and go to your abuser and go reconcile. Like, if God tells you to do something, you do what God's told you to do. But that has nothing of forgiveness had anything to do with going and having a moment with that person. But every single one of us can walk out of this room and we can do these things. We can pray for them and we can bless them. Now, some of you are like, man, Pastor Tom, I don't even know how we're going to do that. Like, how do I do that? Well, you start small. That's where you got to start somewhere. You start at a small place. I've had to do this in my life with people that have hurt me, and I start small. And this is the only prayer that I can muster in that moment. I say, God, don't smite them. You know, it's like, God, don't destroy. You have the power, God. You could destroy them, but God, just don't destroy them. And then God starts to work on my heart. And then I start to pray, God, because I know he said that I'm supposed to bless those who hurt me. Then I say, God, would you bless them? Like not in a big way. Like if you got some stuff left over, maybe you just give them that, you know. Like, and then then God works on your heart. And the next thing you know is you're praying, God, you know what? Would you just use this to get them closer to you? And the moment that you can get to that place where you stop rehearsing the wrong over and over and over in your mind, and instead you say, God, would you use this to transform their life, is the moment that you're getting close. Pastor Craig Rochelle once said, your prayer for others may not change them, but it'll always change you. I think there's so much wisdom in that statement. I think there's so much power there because that's exactly what happens. It's a spiritual thing that occurs inside of you as I'm praying, God, would you bless this person that has hurt me? And what it's doing is unshackling me. It's unshackling me from the bondage of unforgiveness. And now I realize like this hurt that I have, I don't have to hold on to it anymore. And instead of living with bitterness and anger and hatred and letting those things start to infect me, it's like a poison that gets into your body. And instead of living with that and holding on to that, I start to release them of that. And now that toxin gets out of my life. And Jesus teaches us, this is what you're to do. This is what you're to do. Pray that those people will be blessed. Ask God to forgive them the way that he's forgiven you. That's actually what it says. Colossians chapter 3 says this. Forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, watch this. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. I don't know what you've been forgiven of. I can't speak for you. I know me. I know what God's forgiven me of, and it's more than you can fathom. I mean, like, I think about who God changed me from. I think of the guy that I used to be. You know, it's like you're driving down the road, and you ever do this? You're driving down the road, and like, you know, the next thing you know, you're going a lot faster than you should, and none of you, because you're all holy. But for some of us, like, I'm driving down the road, and the next thing I know is, like, I'm going faster than I should be going. And I'm not talking, like, you know, a mile or two, like, and we justify it, you know, like, because it's like, well, I'm late, or I got somewhere to be, and next thing I know, I'm considerably over the speed limit. And as I'm driving there, you know what happens? Like, you top that hill, and there's that cop car that's sitting right there, and, like, you drop out of warp speed, like, you know, you hit the brake, and it's like, no, everything is fine. You know, they're driving real smooth then, but you know that they've seen you and you know what you were doing, you know. That's why you're not surprised when those pretty blue lights start appearing in your rearview mirror, you know, and because you know what you did. And I'm not talking like it's like a mile or two. This is something to dispute. Like, you know that you're going over and you're busted. They got you. And it's like I think about what Jesus has done for us. And I think about, like, in my life before I met Jesus, man, the person that I was. And I mean, man, before I met Jesus, I was a liar. I was angry. I stole. I lusted. I cheated. I'd fight at the drop of a hat, and I'd drop a hat. You know, like, I was that kind of guy. And then after I met Jesus, I still struggle with stuff, you know, like every now and again, just like you know, I have anger, I have bitterness that kind of forms in my heart. I have the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes, and every now and again, the pride of life tries to sneak its ugly head up there. I know exactly who I am, and I know exactly what Jesus forgave me of. And I don't know about you, but I know that it's like I was in that car, and as Jesus walked up, and I know, I'm like, God, you got me busted. And it's instead, Jesus says, I'm going to let you off. And it's not like I'm just going to let you go. He said, I'm going to pay the penalty that you're supposed to pay so that you can be free. I know what he's done for me. I don't know about you, but I know what he's done for me. And he has forgiven me so often and so many times. And this is the thing that he asks us to do. He says, now, just do that again. Do that for somebody else. Just as you've been forgiven, forgive. You know, it's like you go to the doctor's office and there's something wrong, and the doctor looks you over and he says, you know, okay, look, if you'll just follow these instructions, like if you'll just take my prescription, like this is going to help you. You're going to benefit by this. And when I leave that doctor's office, I got a choice, right? I can go right back to the things that I was doing. I can go right back into that, and I can keep going the way that I'm going. Listen, you can keep getting mad, and you can keep ruminating over that thing, and you can keep bringing it up, and you can think about to yourself over and over again, and you think, man, I'm going to give them a piece of my mind. You better be careful. I don't know how many more pieces you got left. Like, you start thinking about that. You can keep doing that. You can walk right out of that doctor's office and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to stick it to them, because that's what they have coming to them, and I'm going to tell them. And you can just eat on your own anger, or you can starve yourself away and let it give you ulcers. You can lose sleep over this thing night after night again, or you can decide to do something different. Because otherwise it's going to start convincing you of some other things. And that poison inside of you starts to infect you. The next thing you know, they're saying, well, of course, so-and-so did that, because they're just like so-and-so, and everybody does that. You see the toxin that's inside of you? You can let that just ruin everything. Or you can make a choice today to walk out of the doctor's office and say, you know what, I'm going to take that prescription, and I'm going to forgive them. And I'm going to release that prisoner, only to discover the prisoner was you all along. And Jesus says, if you'll do that, man, it'll change everything for you. And so the real question today is, what's the Holy Spirit telling you? What is he talking to you about? And I recognize a message like this, it can be both challenging and encouraging all at the same time. And if I've caused any of you to remember something that maybe was done to you, and I apologize for that, but I think it's the best thing that I could help you with today is to lead you in a lifestyle of daily forgiveness. Is to lead you into this idea that every single day, I want to live with my life at a balance of 0. That nobody owes me anything. And I owe no one anything but Jesus. And him I owe everything to.